It's under the church's name, but hers is separate. I don't think the church has it. It's the under the church's yeah. I mean, it's not like I'm doing this.
You're not bringing back starting.
Yeah, I think she's coming back. You know,
I love mobile.
thanks. Yeah, she's been long. I went there before she was married. And I was going to give her something. So I don't know if I say yeah, let me double check that, but I'm pretty sure I think. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
All right.
folks, we're going to get started here pretty soon with our Bible class. We're going to be in Jeremiah chapter 10 today. Before we get started on that, does anybody have any announcements or prayer requests or anything they need to make known? Make known is a nice broad term, isn't it? Okay.
My friend in Arkansas whose dad is stage 4 cancer, he is going down here pretty quickly.
Okay.
Say to the congregation that we were just downstairs, the men just talking about, where we're at, preaching and teaching and thinking about themes for next year and the direction of the church. And so we're in prayer over that. I just want to invite everybody also to be in prayer over that. We're thinking purposefully about, where we are as a body and how we can grow and meet not only the needs in the body, but have an effect in the community around us. And so it's being intentional about that. Excited.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody mention keep praying for Holland.
I have announcements this morning before services too, so I'm going to get it all on my notes right now. Yeah.
I think most everyone here already knows, but just prayers for a continued healthy pregnancy and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Really? Who's that? Who's pregnant? What was that? Huh? We should be more specific. We got a bun in the oven back there.
Little bun in the oven.
I'm gonna be a grandma again.
All right.
Congratulations, buddy.
Thank you.
All right. All right, let's have a word of prayer and then we'll kind of dig into this. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity we have to gather here and to study your word. We thank you that you've given us your word that is so readily available. We think throughout history of people where we would be gathering here because we had one Bible and we would be gathering to study that. Now we have a whole building full of Bibles and tools available. And we recognize the blessing in that. We ask that you would be with us, help us not to become calloused to the blessings that we have. Help us to use these tools to draw close to you. Be with this congregation and everything that we do. Help us to do things in accordance with your will and help us to always be drawing closer to you and growing spiritually. We ask that you be with those that were mentioned. Be with Lisa's friend in Arkansas with the deteriorating stage 4 cancer and that situation. Be with others we know that are dealing with cancer. Be with Lee Morrison. Be with Ann Fagan. Be with everybody else that's dealing with health problems and those that are recovering from recent surgeries and procedures. Be with the many people that are traveling this time of year. Keep them safe, particularly in this winter season. Be with the pregnancies that we know of going on and the joy of new life. Help that all to go well. Be with us, as is mentioned, as a congregation. Be with the men as we plan things that we're going to do next year and into the future, and as we try and be purposeful in approaching that. Be with our brothers in Homer and challenges that they face there. Help us to be looking for opportunities to help them other Christians, near and far, and to be looking for opportunities to reach out to those in the community around us that need to learn more about you. Again, be with our time, help this class to be useful, help us to learn things that draw us closer to you. These prayers and thanks we give in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. I have my notes in a couple different places, but as said, we're going to be in Jeremiah 10. It's a well-known chapter. It's really, really fun chapter. But we had mentioned this when we were introducing Jeremiah, that Jeremiah doesn't always follow chronological timelines. There are some people, some scholars that believe some of these verses in this chapter are out of chronological timeline, and therefore they want to reject the whole thing. It's just amazing how many often people look for opportunities. We can reject that because of this. Well, I don't really think it matters because, as we said, Jeremiah doesn't tend to follow a chronological timeline, but there are some interesting things in here. But I thought it was useful to have some context. So we're going to have to back up into chapter 9 to realize why Jeremiah is talking about what he's talking about here in chapter 10. So if we look at the last couple verses, I think that's all we need to out of Jeremiah 9. It says, "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will punish all them which are circumcised with the uncircumcised. Egypt and Judah and Edom and the children of Ammon and Moab and all that are in the utmost corners that dwell in the wilderness. For all these nations are uncircumcised, and all the house of Israel are uncircumcised in the heart." So that's his words right before he goes into this. And really, I also want to look at the last verse of this chapter, because what you have here, it puts it in a perspective of, he put this in here, and it's right between these two passages, because the last verse, verse 25 of chapter 10 says, "Pour out thy fury upon the heathen that know thee not, and upon the families that call not on thy name. For they have eaten up Jacob, and devoured him and consumed him, and have made his habitation desolate." So we have inserted here, in between these verses, that are saying judgment's coming. His context was you're going to be judged along with the uncircumcised, and as he said right in the last verse of chapter 9, because you're uncircumcised in heart. So really, Jeremiah is going to take a moment and talk about idolatry in the first 16 or so verses of this chapter. And to summarize, this chapter can be divided into 3 sections. The first 16 verses talk about idolatry, and also comparing idolatry and idols to God, and how they're, as we might say in our modern vernacular, there is no comparison. But he is making that comparison. It's like, but there's just like, we might say night and day difference. And we are going to spend a lot of time on those particular verses today, in the first half of this chapter. The next section, which starts in either verse 17 or 18, depending on how you look at it, is a section where we get into a part where it says, "Thus saith the Lord." And there's more judgment language going on. Hopefully we have time when we get to that, but I don't have a lot on it because it pretty much explains itself. And then the final 3 verses of the chapter are Jeremiah's answer to the Lord. Or if you have some versions of the Bible will have like little subheadings, and it will label this last bit as like Jeremiah's prayer. But the voice changes because, like I said, in the first half, Jeremiah's talking about idolatry, and then it switches to "For thus saith the Lord." He talks about the woes that are to come, which we've been covering a lot in this book, so it's going to be familiar language. And then the last 3 verses, the voice changes again as Jeremiah answering the Lord. And, language like, "Oh Lord, correct me." And we'll get to that. Again, also, even though I don't think we'll spend a lot of time on that, just because I think we're going to use up most of our time in the beginning. So I found several things interesting, some that I was aware of, and I'm going to share with you, but I also found some things that I wasn't aware of, some that are like, "Ooh, that's interesting," and some that were like, "That is really cool," in these first 16 verses. But I'm just going to go ahead and read these, and then we'll get into that. Jeremiah chapter 10. "Hear ye the word which the Lord speaketh unto you, O house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven. For the heathen are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. They deck it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not. They are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. They must needs be born, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil. Neither also is it in them to do good. For as much as there is none like unto thee, O Lord, thou art great, and thy name is great in might. Who would not fear thee, O King of nations? For to thee doth it appertain. For as much as among all the wise men of the nations, and in all their kingdoms, there is none like unto thee. But they are altogether brutish and foolish. The stock is a doctrine of vanities. Silver spread on the plates is brought from Tarshish, and gold from Uphaz. And the work of the workman in the hands of the founder, blue and purple is their clothing. They are all the work of cunning men. But the Lord is the true God. He is the living God, and an everlasting King. At his wrath the earth shall tremble, and the nations shall not be able to abide his indignation. Thus shall ye say unto them, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth, even they shall perish from the earth, and from under these heavens. He hath made the earth by his power, he hath established the world by his wisdom, and hath stretched out the heavens by his discretion. When he uttered his voice, there is a multitude of waters in the heavens, and he causes the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He maketh lightning with rain, and bringeth forth the wind out of his treasures. Every man is brutish in his knowledge. Every founder is confounded by the graven image. For his molten image is a falsehood, and there is no breath in them. They are vanity, and the work of errors. In the time of their visitation they shall perish. The portion of Jacob is not like them, for he is the former of all things, and Israel is the rod of his inheritance. The Lord of hosts is his name. So, we see this whole passage talking about idols. But before we get into that, I'd like to note, this is a well-known passage when I was growing up with my mom's side of the family, which did not celebrate Christmas. And the context being that in verses 3 through 5, there's a lot of people, and you can even Google this, it'll come right up, that think this is speaking out against Christmas trees, where it says, for the custom of the people are vain, for one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands, the workman with his axe. They deck it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers, that it move not. So if you're not familiar with that, and many of you may have been, that's a really common thing. Now, I think it's very obvious that this passage is talking about idolatry. And we can go to Isaiah 44 and see very similar language. If we go to 44, starting in verse 9 or so. They that make a graven image are all of them vanity, and their delectable things shall not profit, and they are their own witnesses. They see not, nor know, that they may be ashamed. Who hath formed a god or a molten graven image that is profitable for nothing? Behold, all his fellows shall be ashamed, and the workmen they are of men. Let them all be gathered together, and let them stand up. Yet they shall fear, and they shall be ashamed together. The smith with the tongs both worketh in the coals, and fashion it with hammers. and worketh in it with the strength of his arms. Yea, he is hungry, and his strength faileth. He drinketh no water, and is faint. The carpenter stretches out his rule. He marketh it out with a line. He fitteth it with planes. And he marketh it out with the compass, and maketh it after the figure of a man, according to the beauty of a man, that it may remain in the house. He heweth him down cedars, and taketh the cypress and the oak, which he strengtheneth for himself among the trees of the forest. He planteth an ash, and the rain doth nourish it. Then shall it be for a man to burn, for he will take thereof and warm himself. Yea, he kindleth and baketh bread. He maketh a god, and worships it. He maketh the graven image, and falleth down thereto. He burneth part thereof in the fire, and part thereof he eateth the flesh. He roasteth roast, and is satisfied. Yea, he warmeth himself, and saith, Ah, I am warm, I have seen the fire. And the residue thereof he makes a god, even his graven image. He falleth down unto it, and worshipeth it, and prayeth unto it, and saying, Deliver me, thou art my God. They have not known, nor understand, for he has shut their eyes, that they cannot see, and their hearts they cannot understand. And none considereth in his heart, and neither is there knowledge nor understanding to say, I have burned part of it in the fire, yea, also I have baked bread upon the coals thereof. I have roasted flesh and eaten it. And shall I make the residue thereof an abomination? Shall I fall down to the stalk of a tree? Can't help but compare these two passages. They're really talking about exactly the same. They're literally the prophets making fun of the people that make these idols. It's like, you cut down this tree, you use half of it to bake your bread, and you make an idol of the other half of it. Really, the only part that benefited them was baking the bread. But in comparing that, you don't really see people use that similar passage in Isaiah as an argument against Christmas trees, because it doesn't talk about fastening them upright. And so, as I said, I don't really think this passage has anything to do with Christmas trees. And I was thinking about that, and I would say unless Christmas becomes an idol for you. And there's probably people out there for whom it is, but I think it's, since this passage is looking at idolatry, I thought it would be a really good time for us to look at several passages on idolatry. So I'd like to start in the Old Testament and look at one, and then we'll move into the New Testament and kind of just look at some passages on idolatry, because this is what Jeremiah is talking about. It's really good that we could get a little more of an understanding of this, because it's really relevant, rather than going through this. Later, I hope to get into a few of these verses in particular, but I'd like to take the time to get elsewhere and kind of understand what we're talking about. So if somebody would like to read Exodus 20, verses 1 through 6.
1 through 6.
Yeah, 1 through 6.
And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath it, or that which is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down before them or to serve them, for I, the Lord, am your God. And I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, to the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to the thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments.
All right, yeah, so we have this passage, and we see in verse 3 that says, you shall have no other gods before me. I think we can start with, in defining idolatry, as here's one thing. Putting anything above God, that's idolatry. We also get the very classic definition. In verse 4, we see not to make a likeness. Now, in this case, it's thou shalt not make any graven image or any likeness of anything in heaven above or earth beneath and the water under the earth. The language is a little bit vague as to whether it's any kind of image, but I really think it's talking about making an image of God. And of course, as we study history, we see that with the calves that were made by Rehoboam and others. This attempt, don't be like these nations around us that make images of their God. Don't make an image of me. And in verse 5, it says not to worship a likeness. And in this case, I think it's talking about any likeness. So we have idolatry, it's like putting anything above God is idolatry. Graven images of God or any other gods, little g, big G, is idolatry. And worshiping those things is idolatry. So we see all that here in the Old Testament, and it gives us, a really good summary. That's why I wanted to go to this passage of what idolatry is, what Jeremiah was talking about. But I'd like to look at 3 passages in the New Testament, and as the New Testament often does, we start to see the heart of the matter. It begins to change our definition a little bit of what we're thinking of as idolatry. So some passages that some people could be looking up: Luke 16, 13 and 14, Colossians 3:5, and Ephesians 5:5.
Luke 16,
Luke 16, 13 and 14.
no servant can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or he will hold the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. And the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they scoffed.
Yeah, so we see a very similar passage in Matthew, but it doesn't quite give us much detail. In the King James, it says, "And the Pharisees who were covetous heard these things, and they derided him." Jesus is pointing out you can't serve 2 masters. And the Pharisees, who were covetous or loved money, some translations may say greedy in that passage. Because of their greed, they didn't like what Jesus said there. Does somebody have Colossians 3:5? Okay, Ben, go ahead.
Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry.
So there you have it again. And again, the King James says covetousness. I think most translations on that one does, but there may be some that say greed. Covetousness, which is idolatry. We find very similar language in Ephesians 5:5. Does anybody have Ephesians 5:5?
For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure, or who is covetous, that is, an idolater, has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God.
So once again, we see covetousness being called out as idolatry. So we see this again, the New Testament begins to be more concerned with the heart of the matter. The Old Testament defined what idolatry was back in Exodus. I'd say that definition is still valid. But what the New Testament does is it begins addressing, well, why are these people being idolatrous? Well, their covetousness is a root cause. Their greed, their desire to have things that they don't. So really, we see it being me or my stuff first over God that is idolatry. And that can come in many things. Money, that was mentioned particularly with the Pharisees there. Careers, fancy cars, 401ks, social statuses, social gatherings, sports, and yes, holiday gatherings, anything if you put it before God, before worshiping God, or you find yourself coveting us, you might need to be worried about idolatry. So I wanted everybody to be aware of the fact that a lot of people will use this about Christmas. Even though I myself don't celebrate Christmas, I don't really think that's what this is talking about, but it really gave me a good opportunity to explore these passages that talk about idolatry, because idolatry can be something that we normally don't even think about it in terms of, we're not out here carving statues and making up these things. Well, idolatry can also be anything that gets between you and God. And really, if I had to summarize this whole chapter and what you need to know about this chapter, that would be it. I mean, he's pointing out how foolish this is. And we look at it, and particularly like the Isaiah passage we read, and we go, those fools, they were baking bread. But then you go to the New Testament, you read the definition of idolatry, and you go, am I that fool? Which one of those things that I just named, how many of those things are important? How many of those things get in the way? That's my big spiel on today's lesson, but let me back up to the rest of my notes. There are a few other interesting things in here. I'll just start going through it kind of verse by verse until we get to the ones that I wanted to hit on. Hear ye the word which the Lord spoke unto you, O house of Israel. Now this is immediately following the fact that he said, you're uncircumcised in heart. So he's just called them uncircumcised in heart, and now he's saying, hear the word which the Lord speaketh unto you. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the sign of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. Generally going through this, they're getting ready to go to Babylon captivity. Babylons are famous for astrology. They look for signs in heaven. And so a very valid warning of don't be dismayed by the signs in heaven. Then he continues on with other idolatrous practices. For the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workman with the axe. They deck it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers that move not. They are upright as a palm tree, but speak not. They must need be born because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil. Neither also is it for them to do good. Now I'd like to stop here at verse 5, just because I found something rather interesting in verse 5 that is translated significantly different in different versions. Does anybody have the ESV? Would you like to read verse 5 for me?
Their idols are like scarecrows in a cucumber field, and they cannot speak. They have to be carried, for they cannot walk. Do not be afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither is it in them to do good.
Yep. So, and the King James says, for they are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. So, we have this significantly different language of upright as a palm tree, or there are scarecrows in a cucumber field. Scarecrows in a cucumber field is kind of cute, but I wanted to really look at the language behind it, and I have to say, I don't really see anything that really supports that translation. I don't understand why so many, but it's a very common translation. Basically, other than the New King James, anything translated since 1950 uses the scarecrows in the cucumber field, or some will say scarecrows in a melon field. I can see melons and cucumbers when you're translating from a different language, getting a little bit mixed up. The word there that apparently causes the problem is the word ketomer. And ketomer is only used there, but the root word tomer, or maybe I'm mixing that up, is also used in Judges 4:5, where it talks about Deborah being under the palm tree. That's where she dwelt, Deborah by the palm tree. So that's why it was translated palm tree. The root word means upright, this word was typically used to refer to a palm tree, but it also has that meaning of upright. Some say that it could mean a pole set upright. The other word there is miskwa. And miskwa means turned or beaten metal, stiff or hard. And some people think that because it means stiff, that that's the word upright. And they claim that ketomer has two meanings, either palm trees or melons, but I just am not finding that looking at the Hebrew. So I'm really not finding, the upright part is definitely there, and I understand. I just see nothing that would support the translation of melons or cucumbers, either one. Miskwa means turned or beaten metal. Anytime it's used in like descriptions of they were building a temple. And as near as I can tell, the hard part, it doesn't mean Rockwell hard. It's like when you're taking a metal and you're testing how hard it is. It's more like hard as in difficult. And the reason it could be turned or beaten, if any of you have ever done any metal work, have you ever seen turned metal where people do really fancy metal work and they turn it out? But also you've seen like hand beaten metal work where somebody built something and they just, like, I knew a guy who could build fenders. He's, I'm sure passed on by now. He's one of the last geniuses that, you know, you give him a block and like hammer. It's like, hey, go, here's a fender. It's like, wow, how'd you do that with just a sheet of metal and a hammer? I used to play with some of that when I was younger, and I never really pursued it farther. But the usage was, it's this fancy work. So I think the ASV, as near as when well, actually you have the ASV. Would you mind reading verse 5 there for us?
There's a marginal reading of the palm tree. They're like a palm tree or a pillar, so turn to work and speak not. They must needs be borne or carried, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither is it in them to do.
Okay. Yeah, I found one other obscure translation that was very similar, and it actually used pillar.
Pillars are marginal.
It is within the margin, and like I said, the root word of that word ketomer is upright. So I can see pillar or post or palm tree. It means that. And the other word there is miskwa, which is the turned or beaten metal. So it's a tree or a pole that's upright with fancy metal working on it. So that seems to be the reason for it. That seems to be a reasonable translation. I still don't understand where the scarecrow and the cucumber thing come from. I ran across some theories. Like I said, I found several commenters that were trying to say, well, this word miskwa could mean cucumber. And it's like, I haven't found anywhere that says it can be. One theory is that they actually borrowed from the book of Baruch, which is one of the apocryphal books that it's in the Catholic Bible, but was rejected by pretty much everybody else. There is a letter, you know, the 6th chapter of the book of Baruch was supposedly a letter from Jeremiah. It has language very similar to this. And it uses in this place the scarecrow in a cucumber or melon field part. So there are some people that believe that that's where the concept came from. And since the passage is pretty much the same, that's where they came up with the language. I don't really know, because again, looking at the base language, I don't understand how you come up with scarecrows in a melon field. It works. It's a reasonable definition of, you know, they're sticking something upright, but it's really a very seemingly poor translation. But it's possible that it came from Baruch 6, verse 69 and 70. Which if you get a hold of a Catholic Bible, you'd be able to find that, or if you had a copy of the Apocryphy. If so, I find that a little bit disturbing that that's where they would pull it from. And also, like I said, looking at it, it's just fascinating to me, since I like translations, that it's so different. Palm tree versus scarecrow in a melon field. So there's definitely something going on there. And I will admit that word is rather obscure, but it is used twice in the Old Testament, the word ketomer, and miskwa is used several times. I forget, 8 or 10 times. So, but I'll try not to beat that too hard, and we'll move on. For as much as there is none like unto thee, O Lord, thou art great, and thy name is great in might. Who would not fear thee, O King of nations? For to thee doth it appertain. For as much as among all wise men of the nations, and in all their kingdoms, there is none like unto thee. But they are altogether brutish and foolish. Their stock is a doctrine of vanities. Silver spread unto plates is brought from Tarshish, and gold from Uphaz. The work of the workmen in the hands of the founders. Blue and purple is their clothing, and they are all the work of cunning men. But the Lord is the true God. He is the living God and everlasting King. At his wrath the earth shall tremble, and the nations shall not be able to abide in his indignation. This is one where I'd like to kind of use a visual aid, because this is actually really kind of cool, the first part of this, where it's, but the Lord is the true God. In Hebrew, this is very simple. Emet Elohim Yahweh. Emet means truth. Truth, God, Lord would be English. I mean, depending on how you want to translate law, Yahweh, some would translate it Jehovah, some would translate it Lord, but very simple, but I'm not alone. I looked at several commentators that pointed out that this is very similar language to what is used numerous times in the Gospel of John, where it talks about God being truth, and in 1 John, I think 1 John chapter 5, but I could be wrong on that. But I just find it, I like these common threads where you see these same things from way back all the way forward, that you know, we talk a lot about this today. So they talked about it back then here. They talked about it in the Gospel of John. We talk about it now. Truth. What is truth? Well, here they're saying this is the truth. God is the truth. And of course it's translated as, but the Lord is the true God. Now, of course, the contrast here is, we've just talked about all these false gods. You know, whether they're a pole or a palm tree covered with fancy metal, or whether they're a scarecrow in a cucumber field. He's made all these things that point out how worthless. You know, it's silver spread on plates and gold and the craftsmanship of a man with blue and purple clothing. But the Lord is the true God. He is the living God and an everlasting King. At his wrath the earth shall tremble, and the nations shall not be able to abide his indignation. So that's easy enough to understand. He's making that contrast, but I just thought that particular phrase, especially how simple it is in Hebrew, was kind of cool. So that was something I wanted to share with you. And then we get to verse 11, and verse 11 is also very fascinating. Verse 11 says, "Thus shall ye say unto them, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth, even they shall perish from the earth and from under these heavens." Now what's fascinating about this is most of Jeremiah was written in Hebrew. Verse 11 was not. It was written in Aramaic or Chaldean, and I haven't been able to figure out if there's a difference. It's written in the language of where Israel was going to be carried off. Now this is why some people say that this shouldn't be in here, because this was written later. Or some people have even said, that's probably not originally in there, it's probably just somebody made this note later when they had a copy of Jeremiah, and they wrote that in there when they were in Babylon, because the common tongue became Aramaic after the captivity. Others that are more like me, that are defenders of, you know, it's here, it's in God's word, this should be. Other scholars believe, you know, he put it in here, and he literally put this in the tongue that they would need to say it in. For it's, thus shall ye say unto them, the gods that have not made the heavens and the earth, even they shall perish from the earth and from under the heavens. So it's just a fascinating thing. It leads to a lot of controversy that this verse shouldn't be here, or some even think that's why I pointed out this whole 16 chapter section. There's people that would just use that one bit to say, oh, all this doesn't apply. So it's very, very interesting, and I did go back and try and look at what Hebrew resources I had available online. I'm not great at Hebrew, but I just started looking at the words and looking in the concordance, and they're like, an Aramaic word very closely related to this Hebrew word. Oh, okay. So it does appear to be true what I read, that this was written in a different language. And I believe those languages were fairly similar. Might be kind of like when you go to South America, a lot of people speak Portuguese, but it's half mixed with Spanish sometimes, and they're kind of end up with some languages that are somewhat similar. I probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference if somebody came in here and were speaking the two and interchanged them. But if you knew the language, you'd know the difference. But so that was just, excuse me, another fascinating thing. We don't 100% know why, but the fact that it was written in that language does give some credit to the theory that this was put in here as an answer to be given later. We're almost out of time. I don't have a whole lot else, so I'm just going to kind of try and read through the rest of the chapter, and then if we run into anything, we'll take a moment to discuss it. He hath made the earth by his power. He hath established the world by his wisdom, and hath stretched out the heavens by his discretion. When he uttered his voice, there is a multitude of water in the heavens, and he causeth the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He maketh lightnings with rain, and bringeth forth the wind out of his treasures. Every man is brutish in his knowledge. Every founder is confounded by the graven image. For his molten image is falsehood, and there is no breath in them. They are vanity and the works of errors. In the time of their visitation, they shall perish. The portion of Jacob is not like them, for he is the former of all things, and Israel is the rod of his inheritance. The Lord of hosts is his name. So that's kind of the end of what I had described there as that first section of this chapter, where we're talking about idols and idolatry. We're comparing how worthless they are to God. And like I said, we're running out of time, but I'm going to go into this next section. You could say this section starts in verse 18 because that's where the thus saith the Lord is. It's kind of like, where do I break it? But I decided to include 17 in this section because it starts out, gather up thy wares out of the land, O inhabitants of the fortress, for thus saith the Lord. So this is the circumstance. Gather up your stuff, get ready, for thus saith the Lord. And that sets the tone for what the message is going to be in the following verses. For thus saith the Lord, behold, I will sling out the inhabitants of the land at this once, and will distress them, that they may find it so. Woe is me for my hurt. My wound is grievous. But I said, truly this is a grief, and I must bear it. My tabernacle is spoiled, and all of my cords are broken. My children are gone forth of me, and they are not. There is none to stretch forth my tent any more, and to set up my curtains. For the pastors are become brutish, and have not sought the Lord. Therefore they shall not prosper, and their flock shall be scattered. Behold, the noise of the brute is come, and a great commotion out of the north country, to make the cities of Judah desolate, and a den of dragons. This is pretty easy for us to understand at this point, because this is the same message that we've been hearing out of Jeremiah. So we've got this change. We had these verses that followed where he said, you're going to be judged with the uncircumcised. And then he talked about this idolatry, and we get to see why they were going to be judged with the uncircumcised. And so this is just God saying the same things we've been hearing. It's like, he's pointing out that he's been wounded. This is a grief. The tabernacle is spoiled. All that. In the King James, where it says the pastors are become brutish, other translations say shepherds, which of course we realize that's what pastors mean. So that's fairly easy for us to understand. The shepherds are become brutish and have not sought the Lord. I think King James used pastors there because most people do think he is talking about the leaders of the land, but calling the leaders shepherds makes sense as well. They have not sought the Lord, and therefore their flocks will be scattered. So, like I said, fairly easy section to understand. And then the final three verses, who's speaking changes again. And we change to where it's Jeremiah speaking instead of the Lord speaking, or the thus saith the Lord part. So 23 through the end. O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. O Lord, correct me, but with judgment, and not in thy anger, lest thou bring me to nothing. Pour out thy fury upon the heathen that know thee not, and upon the families that call not on thy name. For they have eaten up Jacob, and devoured him and consumed him, and have made his habitation desolate. So some very interesting things in here. In verse 24, O Lord, correct me, but with judgment and not with anger. So I think that's a very wise thing. Is like Jeremiah saying, go ahead and correct me with judgment, but not with anger, lest you bring me to nothing. I think that's an attitude we should all have. And then he says, go ahead and pour your fury out on the heathen, but then he also includes, and upon the families that call not on thy name. They have eaten up Jacob and have devoured him. So he's realizing, I think when he's saying families here, at least as I read it, he's talking about those that were of Israel that had ceased to call on the name of the Lord. Because the heathen and the Israelites, those of Jacob, that had ceased to call on the name of the Lord is what had eaten up Jacob. And that was the point of this earlier section in here, talking about idolatry. These are the practices that had destroyed Israel and brought them to this point where they were going to be carried away. That's pretty much all I have. Does anybody have anything before we wrap up? Any thoughts on any of it?
Yeah, I've always really appreciated why asking the question, why is idolatry so offensive to God?
Mm-hmm.
People a lot of that. I mean, obviously it's offensive to God, but it's a lie. Anything that's from God, that's a lie is not from God and brings about death. But if you really look at, I love the descriptions here, of what they're not. They cannot move. They cannot speak. They cannot walk. There is no breath in them. Part of the reason it's so offensive to God is because God has already given us an image. And that image-bearing nature is within the creation of man. The way God intended man to be, not the way man ends up going, but, the image bearers of God have already been fashioned by God. But that's the purpose of humanity. We're made in the image of God, and the image of God, He created them, and those image-bearing creations of God, they can walk, they can talk, and even these descriptions can be put over into God, which is really a neat thing. God's walking in the garden with Adam, and God breathed life into Adam, after He fashioned him, and so there's this really just beautiful picture of God's intention with mankind, and so part of the offense is God has already set up this image, and every one of us, what's our purpose in life is to bear His image according to His will, and so anything that takes the place of that is just a departure of that, and it's a lie, yes, and also it's a lot less beautiful the way God intended it to be. That's just something I always really appreciated about thinking about why is that offensive to God? And God's like, you guys are departing, you're taking yourself down a notch by putting this piece of wood above you. It's ridiculous. It can't provide for you. Even Jeremiah 41, he kind of repeats the idea here that's in 12, up in 10. The idea is, show me an image, see if it can do either good or bad. It can't do either one of them. It's just ridiculous. And Isaiah has a lot of common language here, but I've always thought that was.
You've got this person who's made this idol, and he's worshiping this idol, and it's like,
Those cooks is really.
it's the other way around. It's like, you're the one who made this. You know, if we were just making art, it's like, these are the craftsmen are the ones that made, the maker is above the made thing. But here they are, as a maker, bowing down to it. It's like, you know, you've got that messed up, and then you've got the part of, you know, it matches with the worshiping the created more than the creator. Right? It's the same problem, except on a much smaller scale of like, oh, well, we created that, but we're gonna worship it. It's like, and then we move up to the more cosmic scale. It's like when we worship the things God created, but we don't worship who created it. It's that craftsman just did something way more cool than that idol that we could bake our bread with, and that's what we
The only reason
benefited.
the craftsman can form that idol is because of the way that he bears the image
Yeah.
of God. But there's a lot of hyperlinks between Jeremiah 10 and Romans chapter 1, 18 and following. You know, the wrath of God is being revealed in Jeremiah, and Paul's going to highlight that in Romans, you know, where the wrath
It's
of God
gonna
is
be
being
the
revealed.
Same thing.
In what way? In the same exact ways.
Yeah.
And for the same exact reason.
It's the same thing because it's the created, it's being placed above the creator, and it just, and I really appreciate looking at where this is in Jeremiah, because he's like taking this moment to say, why are you going to be destroyed? Well, here's why you're going to be destroyed. And that's the whole point of all this idolatry, and realizing this is what has torn you apart. So, yeah. Anything else? All right. We'll take a moment and get ready for worship.
How you doing, man? Hey, that's a pretty picture. But mine, we have